The year was 281 BC, and Rome was not yet Rome. She was a city of farmers and soldiers, her dominions stretching across the Italian peninsula like fingers grasping for something greater. The Senate met in chambers that smelled of sweat and ambition, men in rough togas debating the fate of Greek cities they barely understood. But in the south, in the perfumed halls of Tarentum, different men gathered, Greeks who had built their colony centuries before, who looked upon the Romans as barbarians dressed in the skin of civilization. They had made a fatal mistake. They had attacked Roman ships in their harbor, killed Roman envoys, and now they faced the consequences. The Roman legions were coming. Tarentum's council was a chaos of shouting voices and trembling hands. They were merchants and philosophers, not warriors. Their army was a joke, their walls untested. They needed a savior. Before we begin this journey into one of ancient Italy's darkest and most unspeakable stories, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear is a story that official history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. Across the Adriatic Sea in the mountain kingdom of Epirus, a man received their desperate message. His name was Pyrrhus, and he had been waiting his entire life for such a call. At 39 years old, Pyrrhus was already a legend. Cousin to Alexander the Great through his mother's blood, he had been a king at 12, an exile at 17, a mercenary at 20. He had fought beside and against the successors of Alexander's shattered empire, learning war from the greatest generals of the age. Hannibal Barca, who would later bring Rome to her knees, called Pyrrhus the greatest commander who ever lived. This was not flattery. It was recognition from one master to another. Pyrrhus stood 6 feet tall in an age of smaller men. A childhood injury had fused his upper teeth into a single continuous bone, giving his smile a predatory quality that unsettled ambassadors and terrified enemies. He fought in the front lines, his silver armor becoming a beacon that drew warriors to their deaths. But what Pyrrhus wanted, what he had always wanted, was an empire. He looked at the map spread before him in his war room. Italy, Sicily, Carthage, perhaps even Rome herself. The Tarentines were offering him gold, soldiers, and a foothold in the west. They saw a protector. Pyrrhus saw a stepping stone. His advisor Cineas, a diplomat of legendary cunning, watched his king trace routes across the Mediterranean with a calloused finger. And after Italy? Cineas asked quietly. After Sicily? After Carthage? Pyrrhus smiled that terrible smile. Then we shall rest, old friend, and drink wine, and enjoy our conquests. Cineas nodded slowly. But my king, what prevents us from drinking wine and resting now? The question hung in the air like smoke. Pyrrhus did not answer. He could not answer because men like Pyrrhus were not built for rest. They were built for glory, and glory was a hunger that grew with every feeding. Within months, Pyrrhus had assembled the finest army the Greek world had seen since Alexander. 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, 20 war elephants, living siege towers that no Italian had ever witnessed. As his ships prepared to sail, a storm scattered his fleet and drowned 2,000 men. Any other commander might have seen an omen. Pyrrhus saw only delay. He would reach Italy with whatever survived. Rome had no idea what was coming. Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus was a practical man. He had risen through Rome's ranks by being competent rather than brilliant, reliable rather than inspired. When the Senate tasked him with crushing the Greek upstarts of Tarentum, he assembled his legions with the methodical precision that defined Roman warfare. 40,000 men, 8 legions, the largest army Rome had ever fielded against a foreign enemy. Laevinus marched south with absolute confidence. He had heard the reports of this Pyrrhus, a mercenary king with delusions of grandeur. The Greeks were soft, everyone knew this. They wrote poetry and debated philosophy while real men built empires. His scouts found the Epirus army encamped near the river Pyrrhus, close to the city of Heraclea. Laevinus studied the enemy positions and felt the first stirring of doubt. The Greek camp was immaculate. Perfectly aligned tents, coordinated patrols, supply lines protected by cavalry screens. This was not the army of philosophers, but it was the creatures that truly disturbed him. They stood at the edge of the Greek lines like gray mountains given legs, elephants. Laevinus had heard stories, merchants' tales of beasts from India and Africa that could crush men like insects. He had dismissed them as exaggeration. Now, watching these monsters tear trees from the earth for their morning meal, he understood that the stories had been modest. His cavalry commanders approached with white faces. Their horses had caught the elephant's scent and were already nervous, pulling at their reins, eyes rolling with primal fear. "We attack at dawn," Levinus announced, projecting confidence he no longer felt. "Before they can organize." But Pyrrhus was already organized. He had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Battle of Heraclea began with Roman confidence and ended with Roman screaming. Levinus sent his cavalry first, expecting to scatter the Greek horsemen and expose their infantry's flanks. The Roman horses charged magnificently, then caught the scent of elephant and transformed into a stampede of terror. Riders were thrown, formations dissolved, and suddenly 3,000 of Rome's finest cavalry were fleeing through their own infantry lines. Pyrrhus watched from horseback, his silver armor gleaming. "Now," he said quietly. The elephants advanced. Roman legionaries were the finest infantry in the Mediterranean. They had conquered Italy through discipline, courage, and tactical flexibility. They had faced screaming Gauls, cunning Samnites, desperate Greeks. They had never faced anything like this. The elephants crashed into Roman lines like ships through waves. Men were trampled, gored, lifted, and thrown. The towers on the elephants' backs rained arrows and javelins into the packed legions. Horses screamed. Men screamed louder. Levinus tried to rally his center, but rally to what? His soldiers were not fleeing from men. They were fleeing from monsters, from nightmares given flesh. You cannot shame a man into fighting a nightmare. By noon, 7,000 Romans lay dead. Pyrrhus had lost 4,000, including many officers who had charged beside their king into the thickest fighting. The Greeks held the field. That night, Pyrrhus walked among the Roman dead with a torch in his hand. Cineas followed, stepping carefully between bodies. "A great victory, my king," Cineas offered. Pyrrhus stopped. He was looking at a Roman soldier, perhaps 20 years old, who had died with his sword still in his hand and his face toward the enemy. "Look at how they fell," Pyrrhus murmured, "all facing forward, all with wounds in front." He turned to Cineas, and his face was troubled. "With soldiers like these, I could conquer the world. Or they could." He looked south, toward Rome. "We must reach the city before they find more men like this." But Rome was already finding them. Pyrrhus marched north. Behind him lay a trail of burning farms and terrified refugees. Ahead lay Rome herself, just 40 miles distant, her walls visible on clear days from his forward scouts. The greatest prize of his life waited like a ripe fruit. But something strange was happening. The Italian cities he had expected to welcome him as a liberator kept their gates closed. The Samnites and Lucanians who had promised troops sent excuses instead. Even Tarentum, the city that had begged for his help, was growing cold. "They fear us," Pyrrhus told Cineas. "Once we take Rome, they will fall over themselves to join us." Cineas said nothing. He had been counting the Roman dead at Heraclea, counting Pyrrhus's dead, counting the reinforcements that were not coming and the supplies that were running low. The math was not favorable. And then the Roman embassy arrived. Gaius Fabricius Licinus was not an impressive man to look upon. Short, balding, dressed in a toga so plain it might have belonged to a farmer. He brought no gifts, no elaborate retinue, no promises of submission. He came to negotiate the return of Roman prisoners. Pyrrhus received him in his command tent, surrounded by treasures from a dozen campaigns, golden cups from Macedonia, silken tapestries from Syria, jeweled weapons from the Far East. He expected the Roman to be awed. Fabricius glanced at the treasures as one might glance at furniture. His eyes settled on Pyrrhus with unsettling directness. "Rome does not ransom prisoners," Fabricius said, "but the Senate has authorized me to discuss terms." "Terms?" Pyrrhus leaned forward. "Rome wishes to surrender. Rome wishes to inform you that we are raising 8 new legions. 80,000 men will be ready within 2 months. We thought you should know, in case it affects your calculations." The tent fell silent. Pyrrhus had destroyed the largest army Rome had ever assembled. He had killed or wounded nearly a quarter of their military-age men in a single afternoon, and Rome's response was to build a larger army. He tried a different approach. That night he held a feast for Fabricius, plying him with the finest wines and most exotic foods. He spoke of the glories they might share, of the kingdoms Fabricius might govern under Pyrrhus's generous hand. Fabricius ate sparingly and drank less. When Pyrrhus offered him gold, enough to make him the richest man in Rome, He set down his cup with quiet finality. "My king," Fabricius said, "I am a farmer. I own 30 acres of land that have been in my family for 7 generations. When this war ends, I will return to that land and work it with my own hands until I die." He stood. "Roman honor is not for sale. Not mine. Not Rome's." The next morning Pyrrhus released his Roman prisoners without ransom. It was a gesture of respect and a test. Rome's response was to send back the prisoners Pyrrhus had lost, also without ransom. Then they sent a message. The 8 new legions were ready. Would Pyrrhus care to meet them? Pyrrhus looked at the message for a long time. "Cineas," he said finally, "have you ever fought a people who refused to accept defeat?" "Only once," Cineas replied, "and we are losing." The second battle came at Asculum, in the heel of the Italian boot, 1 year after Heraclea. Pyrrhus had spent the winter gathering allies, training replacements, and studying Roman tactics with obsessive intensity. He understood now that he faced something unprecedented, a society that could absorb catastrophic losses and emerge stronger. The Romans had learned too. When the armies met across the rolling fields of Asculum, Consul Publius Decius Mus commanded with a new philosophy: neutralize the elephants. His men carried wagons filled with pitch and iron spikes. His cavalry had trained with elephant dummies until the horses no longer feared the scent. His infantry deployed in loose formations that could part around charging beasts like water around stones. The battle lasted 2 days. On the first day, Pyrrhus threw his phalanx against the Roman lines in the traditional Greek fashion, a wall of 20-foot sarissas advancing like a bronze-tipped wave. The Romans gave ground but did not break. When the elephants charged, coordinated teams rushed forward with burning brands, driving the panicked beasts back into their own lines. That night, both armies collapsed in exhaustion. Neither had gained meaningful advantage. The second day was worse. Pyrrhus committed everything. His Thessalian cavalry, the finest in the world, smashed through the Roman right flank. His elephants, handlers now trained to avoid fire, finally broke through the center. His Epirus guard, fighting beside their king, pushed the legions back step by bloody step. By sunset, the Romans retreated. Pyrrhus stood on a hill overlooking the carnage, his armor dented, his shield arm broken, his face caked with other men's blood. Around him lay 6,000 Roman dead, but surrounding those Roman dead were 3,500 Greeks. And among those Greeks were officers who could not be replaced, commanders who had followed Pyrrhus from Epirus, who knew his tactics, who led his veteran units. 2 of his most trusted generals had died in the final push. His elephant corps had been reduced by half. A courier approached with casualty reports. Pyrrhus read them in the fading light, his expression unchanging. Then he handed the papers to Cineas. "Another victory like this," Pyrrhus said quietly, "and we are finished." The phrase would echo through history. 2,000 years later, generals and politicians would still speak of Pyrrhic victories, triumphs that cost more than defeat. In Rome, the Senate received news of Asculum with grim satisfaction. Yes, they had lost another battle. Yes, their dead were being stripped and burned on foreign soil. But they had heard the reports from Greek deserters. Pyrrhus was bleeding out. They raised 12 more legions. Pyrrhus retreated to Tarentum to rebuild his forces. He sent embassy after embassy to Rome, offering peace, alliance, friendship. The terms were generous. Rome would keep her territory, recognize Greek rights in the south, and both nations would stand together against common enemies. The Senate debated for 3 days. A majority seemed ready to accept. Then an old man was carried into the chamber on a litter. Appius Claudius Caecus, the censor who had built Rome's first great road and aqueduct, had been blind for years, but his voice still carried the weight of Roman authority. "I have long been troubled by the blindness of my eyes," Appius said into the hushed chamber. "Now I wish I were deaf as well, so I would not have to hear you disgrace yourselves. How dare you treat with an enemy who stands on Roman soil? Have we become a people who negotiate from our knees?" His speech lasted an hour. By its end, the Senate voted unanimously to reject all terms. The war would continue until one side was destroyed. Pyrrhus received Rome's rejection while standing on the walls of Tarentum, watching his soldiers drill in formations they had executed 100 times before. The men were tired. Their eyes had the hollow look of veterans who have seen too many friends die for too little gain. "We cannot win here," Cineas said. It was not a question. Pyrrhus did not answer immediately. He was looking west, across the sea, toward an island that shimmered in his imagination like a mirage. Sicily. The island had haunted Greek dreams for centuries. Rich in grain, wealthy from trade, strategically positioned between three continents, Alexander himself had planned to conquer it before his early death. Now the Sicilian Greeks were locked in desperate war against Carthage, and they had sent their own embassy begging for Pyrrhus's help. "Let Rome have Italy," Pyrrhus said finally. "For now. Sicily will make us strong enough to take it back." Cineas closed his eyes. He had heard versions of this logic before, at Heraclea, at Asculum, before every campaign that promised final victory. But he was too loyal or too tired to argue. In the spring of 278 BC, Pyrrhus sailed for Sicily with 30,000 men and the desperate hope of a gambler doubling down. For 2 years he was brilliant. The Carthaginians fell before him like wheat before a scythe. He liberated Syracuse, the greatest Greek city in the west. He stormed fortress after fortress along the island's western coast. At Eryx, he personally scaled the walls and killed the Carthaginian commander in single combat. The Greeks of Sicily hailed him as their king, their savior, their god. But Pyrrhus was not a ruler. He was a conqueror. He taxed the Sicilian cities into poverty to fund his campaigns. He executed suspected traitors without trial. He dismissed local leaders and installed his own officers. The same Greeks who had begged for liberation began to whisper that Carthaginian rule had been gentler. The breaking point came at Lilybaeum, the last Carthaginian stronghold on the island. The city was a fortress, surrounded by marshes, supplied by sea, manned by mercenaries who had nowhere to retreat. Pyrrhus besieged it for 2 months without result. His siege equipment was destroyed by sorties. His men died of disease faster than combat. His Sicilian allies began deserting. When a Carthaginian fleet appeared offshore, offering battle, Pyrrhus faced a choice: risk his remaining ships in a naval engagement he might lose, or abandon the siege and admit that Sicily could not be won. He chose to retreat. As his army marched east, back toward Syracuse, the Sicilian cities that had welcomed him now closed their gates. Mamertine mercenaries, former allies, ambushed his rearguard and killed 1,000 men. The island he had conquered was slipping through his fingers like sand. Standing on the deck of his flagship, watching Sicily recede into the distance, Pyrrhus spoke words that would define his legacy. "What a wrestling ground we are leaving for Carthage and Rome." He understood, perhaps for the first time, that his campaigns had not weakened Rome's future enemies. They had exhausted the only powers capable of resisting Roman expansion. The Greek cities of Italy and Sicily, bled dry by his liberation, would fall to Rome within a generation. But Pyrrhus could not stop. To stop was to admit failure, and failure was death for a king who ruled by glory alone. He returned to Italy with an army half the size of the one he had brought to Sicily. Tarentum received him coldly. His remaining allies demanded to know when they would see the victory they had been promised. Pyrrhus had no answer. The Battle of Beneventum was not supposed to happen. Pyrrhus had returned to Italy planning a quick campaign, punish the Roman garrisons in the south, secure his base, and prepare for a proper invasion. He had perhaps 20,000 men, depleted and demoralized, facing Roman forces that now outnumbered him 3-1. Consul Manius Curius Dentatus commanded the Roman army. Like Fabricius before him, he was a man of legendary simplicity, reportedly found cooking turnips in his farmhouse when the Senate's messengers arrived with his commission. But beneath that humble exterior was a general who had spent 3 years studying Pyrrhus's tactics. Dentatus chose the ground carefully. He positioned his legions near Beneventum in broken terrain that would neutralize cavalry and hinder elephant charges. He fortified his camp until it resembled a city. Then he waited. Pyrrhus attempted a night attack, hoping to catch the Romans unprepared. His guides lost their way in the darkness. By the time his troops emerged from the forests, dawn had broken, and Dentatus's legions were already forming. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The Romans had learned their final lesson. When the elephants charged, legionaries with hooked poles pulled down their riders. Others rushed the beasts with flaming torches dipped in pitch. The elephants, maddened by pain and terror, turned and stampeded through their own lines. Pyrrhus fought with desperate courage. Twice he rallied broken units by charging into Roman formations alone. 3 times his guards pulled him back from certain death, but everywhere he turned, his army was dissolving. His phalanx, the core of Greek military power for 2 centuries, collapsed under the weight of Roman persistence. The sarissas that had terrified Italian armies were useless in close combat. Legionaries ducked under the pike points and butchered the helpless phalangites with short swords. By noon, Pyrrhus was fleeing south with 8,000 survivors. He reached Tarentum as a beggar, not a king. The city that had summoned him, that had promised eternal gratitude, now negotiated openly with Rome. His Epirot soldiers demanded to go home. His treasury was empty. His reputation, the only currency that mattered for a mercenary king, was bankrupt. In the autumn of 275 BC, Pyrrhus of Epirus sailed back across the Adriatic with his remaining followers. He left behind a garrison in Tarentum, a promise to return, and absolutely no one who believed him. Italy had broken him, but Italy had not killed him. That honor would belong to an old woman with a roof tile. Pyrrhus returned to Epirus as a different man. The king who had sailed west 6 years earlier had been confident, brilliant, convinced that destiny itself bent to his will. The king who stumbled off the ships at Ambracia was gaunt, gray-haired, and haunted by ghosts only he could see. His kingdom was a ruin. While he had chased glory in the west, his rivals had plundered his territory. Macedonia, once his ally, had absorbed half his lands. The treasury that had funded his Italian adventure was empty. His veteran army was dead in foreign soil. A lesser man might have accepted diminishment. A wiser man might have rebuilt slowly, content with his remaining kingdom. Pyrrhus was neither lesser nor wiser. He was Pyrrhus. Within months he had scraped together another army. Gallic mercenaries, Greek adventurers, the desperate sons of families ruined by his previous wars. It was not the gleaming host he had led to Heraclea, but it would serve. His target was Macedonia itself. King Antigonus II had mocked Pyrrhus during his Italian humiliation, calling him a gambler who had bet his kingdom and lost. Now Pyrrhus would collect that debt. The campaign was shocking in its success. Antigonus's army melted before Pyrrhus's assault. His Gallic mercenaries, promised the loot of Macedonian cities, fought with suicidal ferocity. Within a year, Pyrrhus controlled most of Macedonia and had sent Antigonus fleeing to the coast. But the Gauls were a problem. Drunk on victory and hungry for plunder, they broke into the royal tombs at Aegae, the sacred burial ground of Macedonian kings, including Alexander himself. They scattered ancient bones, melted golden artifacts, and urinated on sacred ground. Pyrrhus did nothing. He needed the Gauls more than he needed Macedonian goodwill. When advisors warned him that he was destroying the loyalty of his new subjects, he dismissed them. Victory would erase all offenses. It always had. Then messengers arrived from Sparta. The great Greek city-state was embroiled in civil war. One faction offered Pyrrhus the throne if he would help them overthrow their rivals. It was another stepping stone, another distraction, another gamble. Pyrrhus accepted. Cineas was dead by now, worn out by decades of following his king on endless campaigns. The voices of caution were silent. There was only Pyrrhus, and Pyrrhus's hunger, and the road south toward the final disaster. Sparta in 272 BC was a shadow of its legendary self. The city that had stopped Persia at Thermopylae, that had crushed Athens in the Peloponnesian War, had dwindled to a few thousand citizens clinging to the memory of greatness. Their famous walls were psychological rather than physical. Spartans had always boasted that their warriors were their walls. Pyrrhus arrived with 25,000 men, expecting the city to surrender. Instead, he found something that had eluded him since Heraclea: enemies who would rather die than yield. The Spartan king was away with the army, but his mother Archidamia organized the defense. When the council proposed sending the women and children to Crete for safety, Archidamia appeared in the assembly hall with a sword. "If Sparta is not worth dying for," she said, "it is not worth living for." The women stayed. They dug trenches beside their husbands. They carried arrows and water to the walls. When Pyrrhus's siege towers approached, grandmothers hurled cooking pots filled with burning oil. Pyrrhus threw assault after assault against the makeshift defenses. Each time, his men were driven back by warriors who refused to count the odds. His son Ptolemy, leading the elite Epirot guard, was killed in a night attack, stabbed through the throat while trying to break through a barricade manned by teenage boys. For the first time, Pyrrhus felt something like despair. He had lost his best officers in Italy, his treasure in Sicily, his son in Sparta. What remained? Then messengers brought news. Argos, another Greek city, was in civil war. One faction was offering him gold and soldiers if he would help them seize power. Pyrrhus abandoned the siege of Sparta in a single night. He did not bury his son properly. He did not negotiate terms. He simply marched north, chasing the next victory as he had always done. The Spartans watched him go with something like pity. "He runs from us to find easier prey," a young warrior observed. But there is no prey easy enough for a man who cannot stop hunting. Argos was a city of narrow streets and tall houses, designed for commerce rather than war. Pyrrhus entered through a gate opened by his faction's supporters in the dead of night, expecting to catch his enemies sleeping. Instead, he found them waiting. The rival faction had learned of his approach. Their soldiers lined the streets, positioned on rooftops, hiding in doorways. As Pyrrhus's column pushed deeper into the city, they were swallowed by an urban maze designed to destroy armies. The war elephants, which had terrified Roman legions, became liabilities in Argos. They could not turn in the narrow streets. When one beast fell at a bottleneck, it blocked the entire column. Soldiers fighting in front could not retreat. Soldiers in back could not advance. Pyrrhus found himself in a nightmare of house-to-house combat. His formations shattered, his officers scattered, his advantages nullified by geography. He had conquered kingdoms on open battlefields, but he could not conquer a city that fought from its own windows. As dawn broke, he tried to cut his way back to the gate. His guards formed a wedge around him, pushing through streets slippery with blood. Above them, civilians joined the battle, throwing furniture, stones, anything they could lift. A young Argive warrior named Epirus spotted the gleaming armor and charged through the chaos. Pyrrhus saw him coming and raised his sword, but too slowly. His arm that had been broken at Asculum had never fully healed. Epirus's spear took him in the side, punching through armor that had deflected Roman swords. Pyrrhus fell. He was not dead. Not yet. Epirus raised his sword for the killing blow, but the king's eyes were still fierce, still burning with the light that had conquered cities. The young warrior hesitated. From a window above, an old woman watched. Her son was somewhere in the battle, perhaps already dead. She saw the armored king on the ground, saw the young Argive frozen with indecision, and saw what needed to be done. She lifted a roof tile from her hovel and threw it. The tile struck Pyrrhus on the head, crushing his helmet and fracturing his skull. He collapsed unconscious into the bloody street. His guards tried to drag him away, but there was nowhere to go. An Argive soldier pushed through the crowd, recognized the fallen king, and with a single stroke of his sword, severed Pyrrhus's head from his body. The greatest general of his age, the man Hannibal called superior to Alexander, died in a gutter, killed by a housewife's roof tile. He was 46 years old. He had spent 30 of those years at war. He had won every battle that mattered and lost the only thing that counted, the ability to stop. When news of Pyrrhus's death reached Rome, the Senate declared a day of thanksgiving, but the celebration was muted. Too many Roman families had lost sons at Heraclea and Asculum. Too many veterans still woke screaming from dreams of elephants. The victory felt less like triumph than survival. In the forum, old men gathered to discuss what the Greek king's invasion had taught them. The lessons were painful and precious. Rome learned that she could lose, badly, repeatedly, catastrophically, and continue fighting. This was not a weakness. It was her greatest strength. Other nations sued for peace after a single lost battle. Rome raised new legions. She learned that glory was less valuable than persistence. Pyrrhus had been brilliant. Rome had been relentless. In the end, relentless won. She learned that enemies who looked invincible were merely untested. The elephants that had seemed like monsters at Heraclea were just animals, large, terrifying, but animals nonetheless. They could be burned, panicked, and turned against their masters. Nothing was invincible to men who refused to give up. Tarentum fell 3 years after Pyrrhus's death, then the rest of Greek Italy, then Sicily, where Pyrrhus had dreamed of empire, then Carthage, then Greece itself, then the world. The boy who ran errands during the siege of Tarentum grew up to be a soldier at Zama, where Rome finally destroyed Hannibal. The grandson of a legionary who died at Asculum commanded centuries in the army that conquered Macedon. The chain of memory stretched unbroken from Pyrrhus's invasion to the age of emperors. They remembered. They always remembered. In the ruins of Argos, Pyrrhus's body was burned with full honors by King Antigonus, who had been his enemy and understood what had been lost. The ashes were sent to Epirus and placed in a modest tomb that no one visits anymore. His kingdom barely survived him. Within a generation, Epirus was absorbed by Macedonia, then by Rome. The royal line that claimed descent from Achilles ended in obscurity, but his legacy lived on in a word. Today, when victory costs more than defeat, when triumph contains the seeds of ruin, when glory destroys the glorious, we call it Pyrrhic. He won every battle and lost everything. Rome lost every battle and won the world. And somewhere in that paradox lies the truth that Pyrrhus never understood, though he spent his whole life searching. The greatest victory is not winning the battle before you. It is being able to fight the next one. Another such victory, and we are finished. 2,000 years later, his words still warn us. Some victories are not worth their cost. Some appetites can never be satisfied. And some wars are won by those wise enough to know when glory is a trap.